jump right in. Today's meeting is very much a follow-up from our March workshop on developing a KM strategy. Around the time that we were hosting that workshop, the Feed the Future Enabling Environment for Food Security project, we're also in the process of developing a multi-year KM implementation plan. And this was to guide how their project integrated KM approaches and tools to improve the enabling environment for food security. So we were really very lucky to bag 2 members of the EEFS team who worked on that to take us through the practical process of conducting the KM assessment and developing the KM strategy or plan. And they've also very graciously agreed to share the key findings as well as lessons learned along the way. So let me introduce them both. First, we have Megan Murphy, who is the Knowledge Management Advisor for the EEFS project. Megan has over 10 years of technical and program management experience working on KM, as well as international and domestic food security issues. She's worked on USAID technical assistance and capacity building projects at Mercy Corps, FHI 360, FinTrack, and QED, where she managed the launch of AgriLinks and other food security knowledge exchange activities under the Knowledge-Driven Microenterprise Development Project. Megan also holds a master's in nutrition and food policy from Tufts University. Hi, Megan. We also have Mira Ibrahimovic, who is a strategic communications advisor with over 15 years of experience in international development. And Mira has primarily worked with public outreach, KM, digital communications, PR, and marketing. Mira has managed complex multi-million-dollar USAID and World Bank projects in Europe, Latin America, and Asia, focusing on agribusiness, trade, and rule of law. Mira also holds a master's in communications from Georgetown. So Megan and Mira, we're very happy to have you with us today. Thank you. And over to you now, Megan, to get us started.
Great. Thank you so much for this opportunity to talk to you today. Can everyone hear me okay?
We sure can, yes.
Okay, excellent. So as Yemisi just mentioned, we're excited to share with you today some of the preliminary lessons learned from our recent experience developing this KM implementation plan using stakeholder input. What I'm going to do is just kick off a little bit, some background about the project, set the stage a little bit about what we're talking about when we talk about our KM, and then I'm going to hand it over to Mira to take us through a little bit more the KM assessment. So as a little bit of background, the Feed the Future Enabling Environment for Food Security project was launched late last year, and this is a global support mechanism led by the Bureau for Food Security within USAID, and was set up to really provide technical, analytical, and advisory support to USAID Washington and Feed the Future aligned regional and country missions. And so we're really set up to do this through a wide range of flexible and rapid response mechanisms, everything from technical assessments to more embedded service provision in close coordination with missions, and a range of different technical support to different types of stakeholder engagement around results. Another key aspect of the project is really our mandate to grow the evidence base and promote the exchange of good practice around enabling environment reforms that can help achieve sustainable improvements in food security. And so that is really where we're focusing a lot of our KM that we're going to talk about today. We're really set up to provide a lot of different types of support. When we talk about our KM, we're really talking about 3 primary ways that we're looking to achieve this, our kind of what we call our KM goals. We want to grow the evidence base and the knowledge base. We want to facilitate the exchange of knowledge around these different types of evidence and good practice. And then we really want to support the use of this evidence in Feed the Future programming. And really why we're doing all of this is to, I think, come back to this key point about being effective and impactful in how the project does our work, and kind of how the Feed the Future initiative approaches the enabling environment aspects of their work. So I did just want to point out something that I think is some helpful context, that USAID, when they designed this mechanism, built into the very beginning, and one of the very first activities, the opportunity to conduct a rapid KM assessment of a range of different potential stakeholders. And as a follow-on to that, set out for us to develop a KM implementation plan that would guide the KM approach across the life of the project. So that is really, I want to just point out what a really incredible opportunity that is, and somewhat unique. I also wanted, I think it's helpful when we use these terms, KM assessment and KM implementation plan. This is a little bit what we're talking about. The plan is actually somewhat of a strategy by its design. And on that note, I'm going to pass baton here to Mira.
Thank you very much, Megan. Good morning to everyone, and I also want to thank Adrienne and Yumisi for giving us this opportunity and to share insights of what we have seen throughout the process of developing our KM strategy and the implementation plan. So basically, why did we do a KM assessment? We wanted to identify the technical issues and the constraints that were most important to our stakeholders, to our key audiences, as they relate to enabling environments for food security. So we really wanted to understand the priority of the technical challenges and issues, and later you're going to see that basically we divided it into Tier 1 issues, which were the most pressing ones, and Tier 2. We also wanted to highlight preferences regarding the format, so how do our key audiences consume knowledge, and the methods for accessing and exchanging this information. We also wanted to document influences, to leverage existing networks and platforms, and you'll see later on there's quite a bit of current networks and online learning platforms that we can tap into. And then we wanted to inform strategies and our approach to increase the uptake and the use of technical information. So how can we be more effective, basically in improving the enabling environment for food security? Here's a little bit about how we went about the assessment. So basically the steps that we took in putting the assessment together. The first step is the methodology, then the second step, the analysis, and then the third and final, the presentation of the results. Just a step back, I mean, the primary objective of the KM assessment was to identify the most effective ways to reach our key audiences and really foster that exchange of knowledge and information, as well as we wanted to, again, identify the technical knowledge gaps. So in the methodology, we used a mixed method of data collection. As you see, we used surveys and interviews. We reached out to USAID folks in Washington and overseas in bilateral and regional missions. We also reached out to multi-stakeholders with an online survey. We used the Survey Gizmo. And this is a range of stakeholders. I mean, stakeholder groups were researchers, private sectors, implementing development partners, commercial partners, donors. And then we also used key informant interviews. We talked to some folks as well, wanted to gauge their insights one-on-one. And lastly, we did a document review, a desk research. Then the next step was the analysis of the data collected. And basically, we did this in the following way. What we did is we identified the technical knowledge gaps and the priorities. And later you'll see what were the 4 issues that really resonated the strongest across the groups, across the key audiences. Then we did how the technical knowledge is being used. So basically, how the stakeholders use this technical knowledge and information. Then we had the knowledge synthesis and communications preferences. How do they prefer, basically, to access the information? Then we had the knowledge exchange formats and preferences, all the relevant online learning platforms to access pertinent information. Who are the trusted sources and influencers? So where do our key audiences go to access trusted information, and where do they engage in what kinds of communities of practice and working groups? And lastly, online exchange platforms. It was interesting to identify basically how many online exchange learning platforms there are, and you'll see later that we identified 23 of them. And then the third and final step was actually presentation of the results. So we had the summary of the findings. Then we did something called the stakeholder user profiles, which basically the purpose was to briefly present what were the differentiators and the different needs of different key audiences, what were their priorities and preferences in knowledge consumption and sharing the knowledge as well. Then we did, and we developed a database of over 23 online platforms. So we reviewed 23 online platforms and basically generated a compilation of information based on a couple of categories, which I'll dive into a little bit later. And lastly, we did recommendations for the KM and implementation. The next slide tells us a little bit about the stakeholder input itself. So where did this input come from? And you'll see the graph. We have on the left-hand side the USAID Feed the Future staff, and on the right-hand side the multi-stakeholder survey. So I'm not going to talk a lot about this because it's pretty self-explanatory, but on the USAID side, primarily the input came from the United States, 46.7%. Then and the rest, really half, the remaining half came from different parts of the world, primarily Africa, 23.3%, followed by Asia and then Latin America. Regarding the multi-stakeholder survey, it was interesting that, yes, almost half came from Africa. Again, not a surprise, knowing that the Feed the Future initiative is really very much concentrated in the continent of Africa. And roughly a quarter coming from the United States and a quarter coming from the rest of the world, including Asia, Latin America, Europe, and Eurasia and Middle East. So the next slide tells us whose views these were. Again, it's primarily USAID, Washington-based, the Bureau of Food Security and other bureaus within USAID, which was, and then the rest were the USAID missions. So the majority was the USAID missions, the bilateral missions, which is 50%. And just as a reminder, there's about 60 bilateral and regional USAID missions across the globe. And then, so we have the USAID missions overseas. 40% was from USAID headquarters, from Bureau of Food Security, followed by USAID Washington, other bureaus, and 3.3 for just USAID regional missions. The next one tells us about the stakeholder input. So this is really a range of stakeholders, multi-stakeholder views. The majority came from the nonprofit organizations and private voluntary groups, followed by for-profit businesses with 18.3% the academic and research institutions, and 16.5% for profit and development companies. Again, I won't go into a lot of detail here. It's pretty self-explanatory. This is a very interesting slide, this one and the next one, which, what have we actually learned? That's the most important. What were the convergences and the divergences of the data that we acquired? So what we found is that the top 3 topics for learning, for any future learning, were the same for both survey groups. So for both USAID stakeholders and multi-stakeholder survey. And as you can see, primarily they were interested in agricultural input policies, market infrastructure and information systems, and institutions and or institutional capacity. So tier 1 were the most pressing ones, and the tier 2 were other topics that were of interest. And what was really an interesting takeaway is that, while there were differences between the groups, there was really a substantial amount of agreement in both. The next slide tells us about the divergences. So what was different? This is interesting because the results vary quite a bit. But as you can see, it tells us, how willing are they to be involved in the technical working groups and communities of practice. And for the multi-stakeholders survey, 41% say that they're frequently involved. And for the folks in USAID, they said basically occasional involvement in working groups and communities of practice. What was interesting actually also was that, the percentage reporting no involvement was actually twice as high among USAID survey respondents. And this is this information is useful because it gives us a good sense of if we're willing to initiate new groups, if we're willing to create new groups, how open are the multi-stakeholders or USAID folks to actually being involved and included and participate in new working groups or communities of practice. The next slide illustrates the different communities of practice and trust sources and working groups that we have identified. We have actually identified 70 different of them, and they really span from formal to informal, local to global working groups and COPs. So what this tells us is that there's a lot to build on. There's really a good foundation to tap into for knowledge exchange to, as Megan mentioned, to really building that and expanding the knowledge base. The next one is just briefly an example of the user profiles that we did, and I mentioned them before. So this is how we synthesized and grouped the data based on different key audiences. So as you can see, we started with the incentives to engage in knowledge sharing, and then what were the most common purposes cited for technical information, top cited issues, preferred methods of knowledge consumption, and preferred methods of exchanging knowledge. The next slide tells us about the online learning platforms, the inventory and the review. As I mentioned, we identified 23 different online learning platforms, and we basically grouped the data into a couple of ways, and as you can see, it's by the name, by the institution, by the funder, the brief description about the online learning platform, its website, what are their key audiences, what are their knowledge products, and some of the illustrative results. The key criteria for reviewing the relevance to the project, we actually had a 1 to 3 scale, and we scored them based on their content management, their site interface, their interactivity and KM exchange functionality, their ability to contribute content, and finally the technical content applicability to FTF and FTF EFC scope. It's interesting to say that the top scoring knowledge sharing and exchange sites were 3 from USAID, AgriLink, Global Innovation Exchange, the East Africa, West Africa, South Africa Trade Hub, and in the 4th and the 5th place came exchange sites and knowledge and sharing and exchange sites from other donors, primarily the Beam Exchange that is funded by the UK Aid, and the South-South Knowledge Exchange from the World Bank. So I think with this, I'm going to turn it back to Megan.
Thanks, Mira.
Sure thing.
So we wrapped up this assessment and very quickly shifted gears into thinking about how do we use this, all this information to inform our approach to KM under the project. And I would say one of the first things that really we decided was important was really to look at setting up kind of guiding principles to organize and prioritize the different strategies you might use under the project. And so this resulted really in six key areas. The first was really the importance of setting up and establishing the project presence and establishing a clear and accessible set of information that all different stakeholders could access easily. And we feel this is important online, but also in person, and have been thinking about it in that way. Secondly, we established that it would be very important that we prioritize and practice internally good knowledge management as a project. With the mandate to do this externally, we decided it was really important to also embed throughout our project operations good knowledge management. Thirdly, we really have as a core, and as we've talked about the project, this one probably makes the clearest sense to a lot of people, which is really our kind of thought leadership and content generation component, really that there's a mandate, and it's very important that we stay true to the generation of new content and the curation and generation of accessible new technical materials to support the knowledge base. Fourthly, we wanted to really emphasize and prioritize the importance of working with the established network of practitioners and thought leaders in this space, and both in terms of KM as well as in terms of enabling environment issues and sectors within that. We also wanted to really put out as a key guiding principle the importance of both leading and participating in knowledge exchange opportunities where we could share the information that we are generating and working on, and also be able to gain additional understanding of the different actors in this space through the participation in knowledge exchange activities. So both contributing as well as both putting forward learning and new knowledge through that our project is working on, as well as making sure that we're really staying very closely linked to the work that's happening by other partners in this space, so that we're making the most of these the many different types of work that are happening. And then lastly, we really wanted to just highlight that we wanted to utilize a lot of the intentionality and systematic approach of CLA in our work. We wanted to both kind of use and build on the different tools that have been put forward by USAID and partners in this space, and then also make sure we feed our work back into that. So these were kind of our guiding principles, and we really looked at how those principles could be implemented through activities that kind of fell for us under three areas: KM infrastructure, technical evidence base, and knowledge exchange. So I wanted to just dive a little bit more into these activity areas and talk about how and why we use them. I think it's really important here to kind of highlight that at this juncture where we were kind of really thinking about how we're going to, what our KM plan is going to look like and how we're going to implement it, we were doing this alongside our annual project work planning process. And so what we really wanted to do was ensure that these two planning documents were aligned. And given the structure of our project, where we kind of have, as many projects do, a component that really is focused on KM. But we also talk about KM as being very integrated and cross-cutting. So we wanted to be able to talk about some specific KM activities, but also be able to weave other activities across our components. And so what we ended up coming up with was kind of that our we would kind of work our KM activities across these three activity areas, but that they could come from different components of the project. Certain ones, like KM infrastructure, tended to fall more squarely in that component. Things like the technical evidence base, that was really very cross-cutting, where we have all different members of our team working on other components that are focused on things like technical assistance and capacity building in terms of training, thought leadership. And so this is where we also wanted to be able to capture the fact that our KM plan is meant to be for the whole project. And so it should be able to incorporate the activities we're doing under those other components. And then lastly, we talked about knowledge exchange activities. I just wanted to be able to give a few examples of each one. Under the first one, we have things like the development of tools, templates, memorandum of understanding with different projects, and some of the development of collateral, communications collateral, and online, developing actually some of our online presence through other websites. In terms of the technical evidence base, I mentioned a few of these, but this was things like doing some of the technical reviews of other projects that are doing work related to enabling environment. There's an opportunity here we see to kind of curate a lot more existing data and technical work out there, and to kind of help connect people more to that in the future. And in general, we really see this as where we're kind of helping work with USAID and other thought leaders to kind of further the state of practice and evidence related to enabling environment for food security. And then lastly, these knowledge exchange, we're really looking at here kind of this strategic identification of opportunities to bring people together to contribute in either new forums and events or through existing ones. And this emphasis on really working with a lot of the networks that we identified during our assessment was really important and a great link for us. I wanted to highlight another part of our KM implementation plan, which really was the development of what we call our integration framework. And it's really kind of the step-by-step process that we, and when I say we, I really mean not just me as KM, but really me alongside our project leadership, to say, how are we going to go about doing this from the beginning when we have a new assignment or a new activity? How do we kind of incorporate KM from the beginning, and kind of what are the key questions we should be asking ourselves? And while a lot of this is really somewhat natural, we found it very helpful to kind of put it down and document it and see if we could be consistent about it and systematic. And it's something we look forward to coming back to at a later date to see how this worked and even how we could improve on it. So basically, I won't go into a lot of detail here. This, along with all the other findings, is in the materials that are below in the web links on your screen. But I think it's just really this process by which we try and identify priorities, like who are we trying to reach, and what is the primary purpose, what do we want to achieve, what do we want them to be able to do as a result of participating in this particular activity or from consuming a particular piece of information, and then kind of going through a process of, are we kind of looking at all the right, let's look at a range of different formats, and then also look at a look at partners as well, really very deliberately looking at who else could we work with to accomplish this. In part, I will say that's because we are a somewhat lean mechanism, and I think that in terms of the intention behind this is to really work closely. We're set up to kind of scale up and scale down, and we're designed to be able to kind of, I think, work with a lot of the existing projects that USAID has out there, as well as the different partners. So I think that's actually really quite exciting and offers us a really great opportunity. And then last, then to really think about this, setting our role and defining our approach after we've really considered that. Because while the assessment provides a lot of great information, as does our implementation plan, there's always a big step around developing an activity that really you have to take in very specific contextual information. And so we really wanted to call that out as an important step in our plan. So I wanted to just highlight a few key things that you might have noticed in terms of some initial learnings here. That leveraging some key bigger takeaways from working on these two pieces, the assessment and then developing this plan, was just it really was very clear just how important it is to leverage existing technical networks and to remember that everyone that we work with is connected to a whole bunch of other actors and stakeholders, and it was really great through the assessment to be reminded of that and that how different those can look, whether it's at different geographic levels. So you think about that could be very local networks as well as more national networks as well as global, as well as just within different issue areas. So there's just networks can be defined in many different ways. So that was a great reminder just by doing this. And that what we call kind of trusted sources, we kind of asked people where they actually went for information recently, and the results that we got really have identified a lot of interesting opportunities for future engagement and exchange. And so just asking people, really we weren't sure if by asking people would actually take the time to fill that in, and it really was. I think it also just reminds us the importance of asking people and then being able to use that. This also just, again, shaped kind of our interest in really building on and utilizing the many different platforms out there. And I will say this is both very strategic and also very practical, and the direction that USAID has been heading in terms of trying to minimize the number of different platforms that are out there, which has many benefits to all of us that work in KM. We know how much investment goes into making those resources effective and useful. But I think what we're also realizing is that we have to be very thoughtful and very strategic about how do you actually build collaborative relationships across these different platforms. But the opportunity is very clearly there from the review that Mira mentioned. There are a lot of places people can go already, and so let's figure out how to really do this. I think another kind of, from a range of the different questions that we asked, we really heard from people in different ways just how important in-person to-person contact really is. And so as we think about these different strategies, that's something that we're looking to continue to unpack. There's a lot of resource challenges that come with in-person activities, and that we acknowledge we won't always be able to do that. But we certainly think there's also a lot more there about just what also is there about a person-to-person contact, and how can that look in different, how can that drive our strategies in different ways. And then lastly, just I think we came away from this reflecting on both the importance of kind of following preferences, and that sometimes those aren't as innovative as we might think, and that people really, for instance, something that came up was routine email newsletters and communications really were across the board pretty highly rated, and I think it was a good reminder to kind of balance innovation and new kind of maybe exciting ways to kind of promote things with really making sure that we stay true to kind of our goals, which are to reach people and to make sure they can use this information. And sometimes And so we should be aligning that as much as possible with their preferences. In terms of where we are now in the project, we're, as I said, still somewhat early. We just launched our plan just as MSC mentioned a few months ago. And so where we are now is really building out our foundational systems and infrastructure for knowledge management. This is the tools and the templates. This is also, we're also actually getting an opportunity to utilize this framework that we mentioned as we're starting off new activities, which is really exciting. So we're getting a chance to kind of hit the ground running with that and look forward to continuing to do that as new activities unfold under the project. We've developed our first MOU with one of our KM partners, the KDAD project, and we look forward to doing more of this. We feel like these are kind of a helpful way to kind of guide collaborative relationships, and we're continuing to prioritize some of these initial online platforms that Mira highlighted as we build out our presence. We are not building our own platform under this project. We are building out presence on other key platforms where our primary audiences are going. We're also responding to USAID's interest and demand for enabling environment knowledge and reforms. And so we're already getting a chance to do some of this review and kind of this landscape analysis of enabling environment reforms that are being done through different projects under the Feed the Future initiative. And then lastly, I think we're excited about shaping some other new knowledge activities, as well as kind of potentially curating some additional content around some of the key priority areas that came up during the assessment. I wanted to just highlight a few other key kind of what I call very early lessons learned and under both of these two activities. I wanted to just say that, you know, we found the process of actually developing our tools to be something that there were a few different resources we were able to find to build our surveys and our key informant guides, but I think this is definitely an area where it will be great to build out more examples so that projects can kind of quickly put these together. And I think we found that the kind of content decisions around what to ask about and balance breadth and depth was certainly kind of a challenge, but an exciting one, and I think one that we really had to keep coming back to. What do we want to achieve under this assessment for our project, and what's going to be most helpful for us for implementation? And I think that continuing to come back to what's going to help the project do its work to achieve its goals was something we found very grounding in terms of making those decisions. I think starting out in a project, you're not as clear as you will be later in a project about sometimes the specificity of your priorities, and so you kind of need to balance being very specific as well as being somewhat more general to be able to use information that might be applicable, you know, at later points. The other one that I was going to mention just was that I think a key thing that came up for us was we found this so useful that we also wanted to think about, well, you know, we had this opportunity up front. How can we build in other opportunities over the life of the project to follow up and see how some of these views or perspectives might be changing? And so I think remembering that a KM assessment is kind of a point-in-time snapshot, and that it can be so helpful to setting a plan, but it doesn't replace certainly the need to kind of have an ongoing discussion with stakeholders about these important kind of preferences and kind of knowledge gaps. In terms of the KM plan, I would say just coming up with a way to structure this as a project was like what was actually a really interesting exercise, and I found that I was reminded by the difference between doing KM kind of at more of an organizational level versus doing KM for a donor-funded project, and just kind of how much there are some really good similarities, and there's a lot of guiding practices that can certainly be applied, but that applying them is in fact kind of an important step to the project context. And I think, again, just being able to build out a plan that can apply to kind of an evolving set of priorities. This is a really dynamic and exciting time for Feed the Future, but we're also looking at a lot of interesting transitions with the coming up, a lot of reflections happening right now in terms of the work done to date with Feed the Future. So that was kind of an important context to our plan. And then I just wanted to highlight that this piece that I kind of mentioned before around the way that we're really emphasizing a lot integration with other projects, or collaboration, I should say, with other projects, was something that we, I think, also feel will be very interesting to review over time in terms of our collaborative approach, and kind of how do we balance, kind of our sphere of influence with the kind of different projects we collaborate with, and being able to set clear goals and roles for each other. And then the other one, just I was going to mention about the integration, was just the importance of integrating KM with other project planning documents, which is our work planning, and so making sure that the KM isn't kind of isolated off by itself, but that it's really part of all of the rest of our project guiding documents. And I think lastly, just this idea of trying to set up something that's systematic yet flexible, because this plan is for 5 years. We hope that is the scope of the project, can be up to 5 years, and so trying to set a plan that can evolve and adjust, but that also can be done strategically. So on that note, I think we will turn. It sounds like it's been great to see some questions coming in the chat box, so that might be sounds like this might be a good time to open it up for Q&A.
Yes, it is. Thank you for that, Megan and Mira. I know I have a few questions. It's been great to hear your practical experiences, though. I think this is an area that quite a few of us find difficult to implement, so this is great. This is very useful. Thank you. Please let us have your questions. Feel free to activate your mic and speak. It's quite an intimate group. There's only about 12 of us online, so let's chat.
Hi, this is Sheila with TOPS. And I have several questions, but I think the first one I want to ask, in what ways is the plan like a strategy? You said at the beginning, Megan, that the plan is a strategy by design, so I was just kind of wondering if you could elaborate on that.
Sure. As I said, I think that the intent behind the implement, it's called, an implementation plan, and I think by that it's kind of our plan for integrating and implementing KM under the project. And so it is to do, the way we structured it was in terms of this, these guiding principles, core activity areas, and then provided a framework for actually integrating into project design or activity design under the project. And we kind of came to this structure through discussion with our USAID leadership team and leadership on the project to say what's going to be most useful for us as a group. And in light of the fact that the timing of the implementation plan really was right alongside the annual work planning document, the development of our PM-EP, and so we kind of said, okay, how do we try and reduce any duplication between these plans and kind of promote a more cohesive set of resources. And so we kind of said, let's, we want the KM implementation plan to be this guiding document for KM. And we want it to lay out examples of different strategies we might use and detail kind of the way that we intend to kind of implement that strategy over time. But then let's really use the annual work planning process to specifically identify, specific activities each year. And let's revisit, and we also built into it kind of revisiting the implementation plan every year as well, so that we could build in learning in future years. So I hope that gives you a better sense. I think this also is largely driven by the type of mechanism. I think the type of mechanism that we are, as well as the timing of the assessment, probably helped guide kind of that format quite a bit.
So Megan, if I could just follow up, this is Sheila again. Did the plan include kind of specific KM and objectives and goals? Because to me, that's one of the main differences between a plan and a strategy. Strategy usually has the objectives, the KM objectives, the goals that line up with the other objectives, goals, principles of the project, and the plan is how you're going to, implement different actions to make sure that you meet those objectives and goals.
So we did actually address both of those in that document. I think we do have goals and objectives in the implementation plan. And so that kind of sets the tone for kind of how we're going to do this over the course of how we're going to do this over the course of the life of the project. And then it lays out a structure for actually implementing them. So it is actually a little bit of both. Great question.
Hi, Megan. And just related.
Sure.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, just great questions, and I think something that I've reflected on is just how much there's kind of key elements around kind of strategy versus plan versus other things, but then how much when we actually look at put the project lens on these, we really have to kind of think about what's going to be what fits in terms of the actual, is it a cooperative? I think even differences between, is this a cooperative agreement? Is this a specific type of contract? And how does that affect what we're going to find most useful in terms of this, these different guiding resources?
Great, and I don't know if you're looking in the chat box. Karen also has a really great question. How does this KM plan integrate with the KM of the overall FTF initiative?
Great question. So we worked with members of the Bureau for Food Security's KM team, and they and we really actually wanted to see how we could do this and how could we kind of make sure that what we were doing was feeding into the overall initiative. We did look at the Feed the Future learning agenda as kind of a potential way to kind of harmonize some of the technical issues with what was in the learning agenda. And what we ended up deciding, given the focus of this project and then the amount of time that had passed since the learning agenda had really been revisited when we were actually starting this activity, that we did consult it. The issues we were looking at were pretty cross-cutting, so they didn't kind of fall squarely into any of the key. The Feed the Future learning agenda has kind of a few specific components, and we didn't feel like we could just focus on any one of them. We were kind of looking at enabling environment as cross-cutting across them all. But we are actually looking at the selection of partners and strategic KM partners, for instance, in particular, being our first one being the KDAD project, which is the primary knowledge management implementation mechanism of the Feed the Future initiative is certainly one way that we are looking to harmonize our approach with other activities. I hope that helps give you a picture.
Great, yes, I think it does. Does anyone online have any questions? I think one of the things that I noted was accessing and sharing technical information via online platforms seems quite a low preferred method. It's still at 46%, but it came fourth out of the 5 top options. Mira confirmed earlier that there were no geographical differences with this.
So just to make sure I understand your question, so you're wondering if kind of the preferences for online, kind of accessing information online had been looked at kind of in a disaggregated way by geography. Okay.
Yes, that's right. And also, sorry, a follow-up to that. This seems a little bit unusual, Mira was saying. Are there any other unusual results, things that you didn't expect at all?
Good question. Well, I can take the first one, which is, we did not go in and disaggregate a lot by different groups or geographies. In part, I think we were trying to balance looking at the information that we got from these surveys in terms of trends and trying to whenever you're dealing with actually numbers and more quantitative results, I think there's just it's a natural thing to get kind of focused on those numbers. But I think needing to also remember that this is just a point-in-time snapshot. It's not a representative sample. It's not, and so we didn't get into a lot of disaggregation. So I think that actually would be very interesting, and it's something we can do. I think we just we're a little cautious about doing it on too many levels because it starts to send the message that we're saying more about a group than we really actually know. And so in many ways tried to look at this in terms of some of the broader trends. And while we did actually see quite a bit of participation, which we were really excited about in these surveys from people outside of the U.S., we haven't actually looked at breaking that out. So it's something we definitely could do. And I think just the fact that we had the level of participation we did from different places does suggest people are engaging. These were done through, we actually sent the surveys through email, some targeted distributions, as well as posted them, the multi-stakeholder survey on the AgriLinks website. And so it does suggest a certain amount of activity coming electronically just from the sheer participation we saw in both online surveys.
Just to piggyback, sorry. Sorry, Megan. I just want to just briefly piggyback on that and just mention that with this result of in-person presentations and conference calls and workshops, that most of our end users were more comfortable of acquiring and exchanging information and just person to person, in person venue. It's really how they learn. I mean, people still like to be present. It really addresses of how people acquire knowledge. That mostly and in general, people are still more comfortable if it's something that is face-to-face where they can actually interact, that it's more in real time versus something that they can do on their time, on online platforms. So it was just a good way in the beginning to to understand this from the get-go, because as you mentioned, now we're really diving into seeing how we can expand this knowledge base. But having this opportunity to understand that both USAID and other stakeholders still prefer face-to-face way of learning was very, very helpful.
I was actually just thinking.
Great.
I was just going to highlight another kind of finding that I wouldn't say was surprising necessarily, but I think it was somewhat stronger than we expected, which was that the likelihood, people's expressed likelihood of using kind of blogs, Twitter, and social media was pretty low, particularly for the USAID audience.
Indeed.
And I think it was a little higher for the multi-stakeholder, but it still was a stronger, unlikely response. Like that was their less preferred. That was somewhat, I don't know if I call it surprising, but it was a stronger finding than we had expected.
Indeed.
Great. Thank you so much both. I think we've run out of time for any more questions, but if you have any questions for either Megan or Mira, please just send them to us and we can pass them on and get some answers for you. So Megan and Mira also wanted to use this opportunity to get some feedback on concrete actions that the EFS project could take to ensure synergy with other aligned projects, as well as get some suggestions for effectively documenting learning around the project's approach to integrating KM. So we're going to do a very quick exercise. We'll break out into 2 rooms. One will focus on collaboration and partnerships, which I believe Mira will facilitate, and Megan will facilitate discussions around learning. There's a notepad in each of the rooms, so feel free to document your thinking. And we will get back together at 12:10 in the main meeting room to share some of these thoughts. So Adrian's going to drop everyone into one of the 2 meeting rooms, and Megan and Mira take it away. Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear us clearly. If you can't, please let us know via the chat box. So we are fast running out of time. So Megan, can we start with the discussions that you had in your group? Just a very quick 3-minute share out.
Sure. So we talked about a few different things that were actually really, I think, some really good points around considering kind of baseline and endline evaluation type activities and really incorporating potentially more qualitative measures as well in terms of focus groups, or another approach that was raised was the most significant change approach as a way of collecting qualitative information on what's working. And yeah, can everyone still hear me? Okay.
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, great. And just to say, this idea of really balancing the stories and kind of qualitative information from with the numbers to help tell the bigger picture and help attribute KM to project goals. And this idea of really hearing from stakeholders directly was another key theme. Oh, Mia, I'm really sorry you can't hear. Fortunately, since you were in our group, I think you have a pretty good idea, but I hope that we can resolve it for you. We kind of ended by saying, we didn't really get a chance to talk about resources, but I think that was another one, like where do we go for kind of information about this. So we kind of talked about maybe exchanging some of that after this event.
Great, thank you. Mira, do you want to go ahead and share some of the thoughts you had in your group?
Sure, sure. Well, I think we agreed basically that there is definitely a lot of networks and online platforms and working groups and communities of practice there. They're available to tap into and really expand the knowledge base. So recreating the wheel would not be would not be the sensible thing to do. And fortunately, you know, under the scope of the project, we don't need to create an online platform, so this is not a default thing. And what we basically talked about is that, and you know, Sheila mentioned this, that, you know, the MOU is a good tool to work with CAM partners, and in our case with the KDAT project. She also underlined the importance of just having the right amount of resources, because it takes a lot of resources really to make sure really that the content is fresh, that the content is maintained, really everything around sustainability of effort. And once you have this, that she also underlined that it's important to have regular meetings, bi-weekly meetings, monthly meetings, you know, to share the plans, to share the lessons learned, to really make sure that both of you are on the same page, all under the umbrella of the Feed the Future initiative. So I think that would pretty much sum it up.
Great, thank you for that, Megan and Mira, and for those insights into sort of developing the KM strategy and making sure that it's very much informed by needs assessment. I know that I have picked up some things today to try when I work to collaborate with others in the FSN space, and I'll be reaching out to some of you with some of those ideas and suggestions. I hope it's been equally useful for everyone who is with us today. So we'll move on to some KMTF updates. Sheila?
Thank you, Yamasi. Especially want to thank Megan and Mira for a really interesting presentation, really useful. Can't wait to look at all the different tools and different things like that came from it. Something that I think is very much needed by the KM community in development and also elsewhere. Just quickly want to update you on a couple of things the task force is working on. You may remember back in February we had a workshop how to develop a knowledge management strategy. Part of that was developing a guide, a tool that'll guide you through the process. I'm happy to report we're in the final proofreading, and then it'll go over to layout phase. So we're getting there, and as soon as that gets out, we'll let all of you know about that. Also, we have been working with the TOPS M&E task force. One thing all the task forces kind of decided we needed some sort of a graphic overlay to see where the two intersect, can work with each other, and what's kind of separate. So that's moving along. We've had members from both task forces come together and kind of help working on that. Also this August, we're going to be having a summer series that's going to focus on measuring online engagement. So be looking for the emails about that. That will be all, online through webinar and discussion forum. So once again, looking for all that type of engagement. And then also, a couple months ago, we hosted an event with KDAD on online and community engagement, and we're still having a discussion on that on the discussion forum on the FSN network. So it's never too late to contribute, so please feel free to kind of log on there and read and contribute anything you're interested in. And that's all I really have, so I'll turn it back to Yamasi. Once again, I want to thank our presenters and also everybody for participating today.
Thank you, Sheila. I think that's it from us for today. As usual, all the slides, the webinar recording, etc. will be loaded onto the FSN network, and you'll be sent a message when this is done. If you have any topics you'd like to present on, any experiences you'd like to share at future KMTF meetings, please do let us know. Thanks again, everyone, and have a good day.
Thank you all.
Thank you.